It's Matt Sager here to talk about the latest episode of Better Call Saul, Season 5, Episode 4, titled Namaste. And before I get into the details of the episode itself, I'd like to talk for just a moment about the director. This was Gordon Smith's directorial debut of Better Call Saul, and it was years in the making. He's got a long history with the franchise of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. He actually started in Season 3 of Breaking Bad as a production assistant, or PA, and if you're not familiar with what that is, it is a labor-intensive, long hours, low-paying, often thankless job that you do out of passion and out of a desire to break into the industry. It is seriously hard work, seriously low pay, seriously long hours. I say this as someone who in his 20s did this once or twice myself. Did it for the Grammy Awards one year, for the Howard Stern New Year's Rotten Eve pageant, for the Tony Awards, and MTV VMAs in the early 90s. It is not easy. You do it out of passion and out of hope to be discovered for something. In my case, it was because I wanted to get on the radio, and that's why I started with Howard Stern. And yeah, in a funny kind of way, it did eventually lead to me getting on K-Rock in a roundabout sort of way. In the case of Gordon Smith, he really busted his ass to get noticed, and after being a production assistant, he was eventually promoted to being the assistant to Vince Gilligan, the show's creator and showrunner. He then moved on to being a writer's assistant, a very coveted job, one of the things a creative PA really wants. And he was good enough at all of these tasks that he was invited to work on Better Call Saul when it first launched as a staff writer. He did a good enough job at that, made enough of an impression, that he now has directed his first episode, and what an episode it was. So with congratulations to Gordon Smith and expecting a lot of great things from him in the future, that out of the way, let's talk about the episode itself. A lot of stuff going on here. If this episode had a theme, and I would say it actually did, that theme is damage control. You wouldn't know it from the beginning, the cold open, in which Saul is at a thrift shop looking to pick up something nice, heavy, and something that can damage something. It at first looks like he's shopping for maybe a murder weapon. He's trying to find TVs heavy enough to drop on something and cause some damage. Perhaps a golf club or a baseball bat to whack over what looks like it's somebody's head. He looks like he's shopping for a very unconventional form of weapon, but he walks out with 3 bowling balls, and we'll find out later what they're for. But once we're past that and past the credits, we pick up on the morning of the last scene of last episode, episode 3, the guy for this, in which Saul and Kim had celebrated their days by drinking beer bottles and tossing them off the terrace of their condo. Here, Kim looks down at the glass at the mess they've caused and sighs, and Saul goes, forget about it. The landlord will take care of it. That's what we pay rent for. She goes, yeah. As with everything she tells Saul these days, she says it sort of half-heartedly, and as soon as he's off for the day, she is in fact down on the ground, sweeping it up, cleaning up her own mess, because that's what Kim's really about. Not Saul so much, but Kim. Although their two differing styles will complement each other and come together in a pretty significant way before this episode's over. And while she is literally cleaning, sweeping up the mess she made last episode, she's also on her new Bluetooth, trying to metaphorically clean up the mess she made with Mesa Verde last episode. This is where, against her nature, she found herself being forced to evict a man from the property in which he'd been living forever at the behest of Mesa Verde, the big money-making client of hers at Schweikart and Coakley. She does not want to evict this guy, and she's trying everything to avoid it. And so she's on the phone as she's sweeping with an assistant of hers, a paralegal perhaps, asking her to pull all the files on the call center that's being built, the various location sites that they'd had in mind and that they'd been pitched, and asking her to pull up all the digital files, all the PowerPoint stuff. Keep in mind, this is 2004, maybe 2005 at the latest, very early in the world of digital litigation. But Kim is on top of it, ready to make a power play to try and get this guy to be able to keep his home, and for her to keep her soul without losing this client and perhaps even her job at Schweikart and Coakley. This Mr. Acker, whom she's finding herself being forced to evict, it's haunting her. She doesn't want to have to kick him out. She doesn't want any part of this ugliness. She's got a conscience that, as is made clear even by the fact that she's sweeping up this mess, is a little bit more, if nothing else, possessed of personal responsibility than that of Saul. Now, talking about cleaning up one's mess, things get very intense, more intense than usual at the typically lighthearted and fun environment of Los Pollos Hermanos, where Gus Fring typically puts on a mask, drops the ruthless gangster shtick, and is very kind and affectionate with his employees. As the staff departs, he confronts the assistant manager, Lyle, and says to him, pointing to the friar, "You find this to be acceptable, do you?" Sounding a lot more like the Gus that we, viewers of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, know, and much less like the Gus that the employees of Los Pollos Hermanos are familiar with. Lyle isn't really sure what the problem is, but he sees that Gus is deeply unhappy. He wants to keep his job for whatever reason, so he stays way past his shift, using steel wool, scrubbers, eventually his fingers, working them raw, trying to get this deep fryer, scummy as it always is going to be, spotless and perfect for a clearly, visibly disturbed Gustavo Fring. Look, the guy's the assistant manager. It's not the best career working at a chicken chain, but he loves his job and he wants to keep it, and his boss is clearly unhappy with him, although that's not what's going on with Gus. Gus is unhappy for a completely different reason, and he's taking it out on poor Lyle. Gus is unhappy because of other events that took place on the last episode of Better Call Saul, in which, working with Nacho, he had to arrange to sacrifice some money and potentially the staff of his other operation, his real operation, his non-civilian role as a drug kingpin. Basically, Crazy 8 was in jail, and Lalo Salamanca brought in Saul Goodman to give Crazy 8 a script about all these dead drops where there would be cash, and this would lead to both seizure of money and potential arrests. Now, this script, given by Lalo to Saul to pass on to Crazy 8, had nothing to do with Salamanca money, Salamanca drugs, or Salamanca drug runners. He was giving up information on Gus, trying to hurt Gus, so that he would lose his special privilege that he's been enjoying with the cartel, Dons Eladio and Bolsa. Gus was made aware of all this by his double agent / slave within the Salamanca crew, Nacho. And so he's trying to mitigate the damage. He's going to give up some of that money, and he's going to put one of his guys at risk. And he's doing so with great care to minimize the damage. So he's got an entire scenario orchestrated in which Hank Schrader and Steve Gomez, who have now made their first appearances on Better Call Saul as of last episode, they're now in the game, and they're being strung along by Gus, who can only sit, wait, and hope that all goes well, and takes out his stress by torturing poor Lyle, have him scrub in the deep fryer. So Victor and Tyrus, Gus's two main lieutenants, are leading Hank and Gomi on a wild goose chase through the beautiful culverts of New Mexico. Culverts being drain pipes, which is where the dead drops allegedly are. He's got some money laid out for them, something along the lines of $700,000 and change. They do uncover that, and they're waiting to find somebody they can arrest. They do. He leads them on a wild goose chase and amazingly escapes capture. All this, again, is being done intentionally to keep the wool over the eyes of the DEA, to save Gus Fring's operation by giving up a little bit of money, let's be honest, a rather fair chunk of change, and by risking key members of his crew. He's got no choice but to do this because Lalo's got him in a bind and it's stressing him the hell out, and somehow it ends up all being on the shoulders of poor Lyle. But Gus manages to clean up his mess, Lyle eventually cleans the deep fryer, poor guy, and Hank and Gomi, while they don't make an arrest, sees a rather large amount of money, and everyone is pretty happy for the night. It goes about as well as it could for all concerned. Gus, interestingly, by the way, is the one character on Better Call Saul who is not really having an arc. That is to say, Saul, as we know him, certainly in the beginning of the series, is not the Saul we come to know on Breaking Bad. The same is true of Mike, and of course of Hector Salamanca. To say nothing of the many cast members we meet who never show up on Breaking Bad. Gus, on the other hand, the moment we meet him, he is a cold, ruthless, calculating bastard of a gangster, successfully operating two lives. One is the face of a lovable owner of a chicken chain, Los Pollos Hermanos, and the other is a deeply entrenched, wildly successful, ruthless, endlessly ambitious drug kingpin. We don't get to watch him become that guy. He's that guy from the jump. Now, it is possible that at the end of this episode, there's a scene that may hint at us getting to know a little bit of a different side of Gus, which would be nice. Because while Giancarlo Esposito's performance has been amazing, as it always is, we haven't gotten to see Gus change, grow, do anything but be the Gus we've always known and loved to hate. However, again, there is something that occurs toward the end of this episode that hints at a potential character arc in place for him. We'll see. Also making an attempt to clean up the mess he's made, our old friend Mike Ehrmantraut. Last episode, he damaged, probably permanently, his relationships with his granddaughter Kaylee and Kaylee's mom, his daughter-in-law, Stacy. He pulls up to the house and asks to come in and babysit, as he does apparently every Thursday night. Stacy doesn't even want to let him in the door, and in fact, she doesn't. She says that, listen, everything's fine. Kaylee forgives you. There's nothing to worry about, Pop, but she's got her sitter, and I'd feel better if you stayed away from Kaylee. Mike insists that everything's fine, and Stacy looks at him, gives him an honest look of concern, and says, really, what are you going to do if she brings up your late son, Maddie, again? Huh? Are you really going to be fine then? He rather unconvincingly says, yes, I'll be fine. He doesn't look like he believes himself. And she tells him, listen, get back to yourself. To which he says, get back to myself. He doesn't like to be called on his shit, no matter how accurate it is. In fact, the more accurate it is, I think the more it hurts. So he very somberly exits, looking, quite honestly, very threatening. The most threatening he's looked around his loved ones, his family, the people that mean the most to him in this world. He's getting ready to, as I've said, sever that part of his life because it's becoming too painful and because he can't function around them. He's going to become a danger to them, and I think he sees that. So once again, just as he did when he left the house last week, he walks down the same street, looking to pick a fight with that same crew of tough guys. This time, though, he doesn't want to hurt somebody. He wants to get hurt, and he does. He gets punched, kicked, beaten, and eventually stabbed. Again, I believe this is an attempted suicide by thug. What actually happens is something a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, also looking to clean up his mess, Howard Hamlin. Howard has had an obnoxious come-to-Jesus moment in which he has discovered his inner Zen Buddhist, complete with a license plate for his obnoxiously wealthy car, just like the title of this episode, Namaste. And it's in this vein that he finally gets the lunch he's been itching for with Jimmy, Saul, who he insists on calling Jimmy, and he asks about Saul Goodman. He asks quite earnestly and quite curiously, what's Saul Goodman about? What's his deal? And Jimmy gives him the whole rap. Saul's the guy who looks after the little guy. He helps the helpless. He's the friend to the friendless, the David to the Goliath. He's the champion of justice when you've got nowhere else to turn. He doesn't yet have his own inflatable guys and commercials, but you can see that's all been formed in his mind. He knows exactly the character of Saul Goodman, and he explains it to Howard, and Howard is frankly impressed. Howard's been impressed, it turns out, ever since an event toward the end of season 4 of Better Call Saul in which Jimmy made a very impassioned speech at the christening of a library in the memory of his late brother Chuck. It was a very endearing and passionate speech, and one that impressed the hell out of me, too, frankly. But for Howard, it was apparently a real turning point, one that started him down this road of, again, really obnoxiously, kind of forgetting what a dick he's been all this time, and earnestly saying to Jimmy, Saul, whatever you want to call him, don't go it alone. I've done you wrong many times. When you were first barred, when you brought me the Sandpiper Crossing case. Sandpiper Crossing, of course, is the retirement home against which Jimmy brought a huge class action lawsuit, and among others, Howard got involved and got quite a payday from it. Each of those times I did you wrong when I should have looked to you as a potential employee. I want to right that wrong and bring you on board. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. I've been thinking about it ever since the incident at that library, and I mean it. Don't make a snap decision now. Think about it. Live with it, as he says. Saul is very uncomfortable through this entire speech, as is the audience. Certainly I was. But just to complete the picture, he gives him a real big hug. There's nothing like an obnoxious Zen master, a guy who doesn't remember, who thinks he's been absolved of all the obnoxious crap he's done to somebody, because now he's found enlightenment and wants to share it. It is frankly repulsive to Saul, and speaking for the audience, was fairly repulsive to me too. It was Howard trying to be lovable, trying to be a good guy, and coming off as despicable as ever, just in a virtual Zen robe covering his three-piece suit. And that ultimately is where those 3 bowling balls that Saul procured at the thrift shop come in, because he brings them to Howard's house, where that obnoxious Namaste car is parked, and one by one drops a bowling ball onto the hood, through the windshield, and onto the roof. Till the alarm goes off, he flees the scene, but I believe he's delivered his message rather succinctly. Whether or not Howard can prove it, whether or not he wants to, Saul finally gets in a little FU, a very well-deserved one, to Howard Hamlin. One years in the making, a long time coming. Howard, who, by the way, even at that lunch where he begs Jimmy, Saul, to come work for him, even in that moment of humility and kindness and generosity, even then he can't help but slip in a Charlie Hustle reference, the most insulting passive-aggressive name he's always had for Jimmy since he worked in the copy room. Charlie Hustle. He said it when he hated him, he said it when he loved him, because Howard, whether he's a preachy guy, whether he's a kind guy, whether he's a jerk, he's always Howard. He's always pretty repulsive. Not necessarily his clothes or even the philosophy he pretends to espouse, but his soul is pretty ugly. Certainly it's the antithesis of Saul's. These are two opposite forces of nature that don't belong anywhere near each other, and Howard should have known better. And so Howard's mess will not be cleaned up, although perhaps his car will be repaired. Finally, we get to see Saul in court, as does Kim, as he breaks out a trademark Saul trick. The owner of a small mom-and-pop store, not unlike the one that Saul's own mom-and-pop once had, was robbed at some point the night of a Kiss concert. And because every other person who visited his store that night was wearing Kiss makeup of one sort or another, dressed up as either Gene Simmons or Paul Stanley, Peter Criss, you know the deal. They were all wearing Kiss makeup, except for this one gentleman who was quite recognizable for his lack of all that attire, makeup, and accoutrements, who bought a candy bar and then reached over the register, grabbed the money, and left. Saul points to his client and says, "And you're sure that this is the guy who robbed your store?" The guy insists, "Yes." Saul goes, "Really? Because you were working a very long day that day, but you're positive you can identify this guy?" "Yes, yes, yes." Saul, of course, has pulled a fast one. His client isn't the man sitting next to him at all, not the man he's been referring to as he's been addressing and cross-examining the witness. His client is, in fact, deep in the audience of the jury. He's brought up a look-alike, a bartender at a local bar. It is a dirty trick, but it results in what he hoped for. After an outcry from the audience and from the jury, and a thorough reaming by the judge, Saul gets what he wanted, what his client paid for, a mistrial. His client goes free, and that's that. And Kim sees her opportunity. Because she's gone to Mesa Verde, she's pitched them this alternate site that doesn't involve evicting Mr. Acker from his home, and Mesa Verde does not care. They want to move forward with their call center. They want to go under budget. They want to save money. And they literally don't care who gets hurt. They want to evict this man for their own convenience. Kim is not okay with this. And so she will do anything to clean up her mess, including calling on the devil himself, Saul Goodman. She wants him to recruit a client. So it is that Mr. Acker gets visited by yet another attorney, and he's so sick of them, he just goes, "Go away. I don't want to hear about it. I'm not giving up my land. You vultures, get out of here." But this is a different lawyer. This is Saul Goodman, friend to the friendless, helper of the helpless, David to Goliath. He wants to help Mr. Acker. Mr. Acker is very interested. This is leading to a showdown, not to mention a dramatic conflict of interest for Kim and for Mesa Verde. Kim will do anything to do the right thing, even if it means getting her hands a little bit dirty. She's cleaning up her mess in a rather unorthodox fashion. And as for Mike, his suicide by thug did not work. He wakes up bandaged, beaten and bruised, and in bad shape, as one would expect after the beating he took. But he is in a compound in an undisclosed location, and as we pan out, it's a rather fancy-looking compound, and it looks to me as though he's been either taken in or possibly abducted. It's a fine line in the world we're talking about, in the world that Mike inhabits. And I would say it's a long shot that he's been taken in by Lalo Salamanca, who, after all, has been very interested in Mike ever since the end of season 4 of Better Call Saul. But far more likely is the employer that we know eventually he becomes very loyal to. And we know that they're on a collision course to become good friends and longtime partners, especially once he's severed ties with the civilian world as he's done. I believe he's in the compound and under the care of Gustavo Fring. Either way, I can't wait to see what comes next. For Mike and Gus, for the Salamancas, for Kim and Saul working together, finally, for the common good no less. All this setting up an excellent and very exciting, highly anticipated in my book episode of Better Call Saul coming next week. Thanks as always. Of course, I'll be recapping that episode, and I'll have more content in between then and now. And in the meantime, I'd love it if you got in touch with me about anything. You can email me, matt@mattsager.com, call me at 646-535-4788, or get me on social media. Let's see, I'm at Matt Sager on Twitter, Real Matt Sager on Instagram, and on Facebook. You can connect with this podcast at facebook.com/Matt Sager Podcast. Check out my voice acting page on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Matt Sager VO. You can also contribute to this podcast. I'd very much appreciate it if you would. You can do so via my Patreon page or through my hosts at anchor.fm. There'll be links for both of those in the podcast description. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. And for everything else related to me, my voiceover reels, contact info, every episode of this podcast to date, articles I've written, much, much more, you can find that on my website, mattsagervoiceover.com.